having been given an unrestricted climb after takeoff from India's Calcutta International Airport. Indian Airlines Flight 257 quickly levelled off at flight level 290, en route to Imphal, the capital of Manipur state, approximately 600 kilometres to the northeast, a relatively short flight time of around 50 minutes or so. Being planned as an intermediate stopover, the intention was to quickly turn the aircraft around before departing again for its ultimate destination of Dimapur, a short hop of about 125 kilometres still further to the north and into the foothills of the Himalayan mountains. What no one on board at the time could have known, however, was that neither the aircraft nor the 69 souls on board would ever reach their destination. Instead, less than 40 minutes into the future, the 737 would impact the steep slopes of the Thangjing Hills, some 40 kilometres or 13 miles to the southwest of the airport in Imphal, while making its final approach to land. In trying to understand why, what follows is a shocking story of one man's propensity to cut corners, and the casual, silent acceptance of another who simply stood by and let him do it. But further still, it's the story of communication breakdown, unchallenged assumptions, and procedural indifference, behavioural patterns which were not unique to this accident flight, but which nonetheless had gone unnoticed due to underlying systemic shortcomings. This is the complete story of what really happened to Indian Airlines Flight 257. Having levelled off in the cruise, 257's planned routing to the northeast would initially take it overhead the Charlie Mike Lima VOR navigation beacon located on the airfield at Comilla in western Bangladesh. In command would be one Captain Shekhar Haldar, aged 37. His total flight experience amounted to just under 3,800 hours, about 2,400 of which had been gained on the 737-200. As such, despite having spent some time previously on the company's Fokker F-27 turboprop fleet, Haldar's commercial flying career to date had predominantly centred around the 737 type, initially as a first officer, before being promoted to captain in November 1989, over a year and a half before the accident flight. During this intervening time period, his time in the left-hand seat had reached nearly 1,100 hours. His colleague on the flight deck that afternoon and occupying the right-hand seat would be one D.B. Roy Chowdhury, aged 31. Chowdhury had, at least per the final accident report, also attained the rank of captain with Indian Airlines. However, having studied the final report in some detail, I have to admit to having some personal reservations with the report's accuracy in this regard. Firstly, although the report clearly documents that Haldar held an airline transport pilot's licence at the time of the accident, Chowdhury apparently had not. Instead, being the holder of a CPL or commercial pilot's licence, its lesser qualification, although adequate to allow him fly the 737, would in itself not have satisfied the minimum licensing requirements for upgrade to command. Additionally, the report attests to the fact that Chowdhury's total flying experience had extended to no more than 1,647 hours, nearly 1,400 of which had been gained as a first officer on the 737, an overall level of experience which again would normally not have been sufficient to justify an upgrade to command. But it would ultimately be Chowdhury's passive acceptance of Haldar's later procedural ill-discipline which gives rise to the greatest of my concerns. If indeed he had been successful in demonstrating the proficiency standard necessary to hold the rank of captain, his actions, or rather his inaction, on the flight deck that afternoon would certainly fall well short of what would have been expected of someone in that position. A mere 25 minutes after departure, as 257 approached the navigation beacon at Comilla, the first telltale signs of this ill-discipline began to manifest itself. Per the file flight plan once overhead Comilla, 257 was supposed to make a left turn and alter course to the north on a track of 007 degrees magnetic, as it continued onward towards the Alpha Alpha Tango navigation beacon at Agartala, a relatively short sector of no more than 28 nautical miles or 52 kilometres. However, this isn't what actually happened. Having been scheduled to depart Calcutta at 11:30 local, 257 had picked up a slight delay on the gate and as such had only gotten airborne at 11:54. meaning that the flight was by now running about 15 to 20 minutes late. That being the case, as the aircraft approached Comilla, Haldar, taking advantage of the fact that there was no radar coverage in this remote region of Bangladesh and northeastern India, had unilaterally decided to take a shortcut, confident in the knowledge that his deviation from the original flight plan couldn't be directly monitored from the ground. Having approached the beacon on a track of 073 degrees magnetic, once overhead, rather than turning the required 66 degrees to the left as he was required to do, he instead had only altered his course by a mere 20 degrees, effectively cutting the corner as he aimed to intercept the outbound track from Agartala to Imphal and claw back some of that lost time. The time was now 12:19 local, exactly 27 minutes and 23 seconds before impact. Given the relatively short sector between the two navigation beacons, just 2 minutes and 44 seconds after passing overhead Comilla, having been previously requested to do so by air traffic control, Chowdhury reported the aircraft's position as having passed overhead Agartala, which, for the reasons we've just mentioned, was in fact a lie.
Indian 257 approaching overhead Alpha Alpha Tango.
In the absence of radar coverage, aircraft are expected to proceed on a procedural basis, meaning that they are obliged to fly from one point to the next along a defined route, reporting verbally overhead each of these points in turn, so that air traffic control have an alternative means by which they can record and monitor the flight's progress. The implications of not doing so are, I believe, self-evident. Being none the wiser, the Bangladeshi controller, having acknowledged 257's fictitious position report, subsequently handed the crew over to their colleagues at Imphal.
Indian 257, you may call and report in contact with Imphal.
A few minutes later, Chowdhury did exactly that, finally making contact with Imphal at 12:24 local, reporting that they were level at flight level 290 and that they were estimating a beam Kumigrum, known these days as Silchar, another navigation beacon just to the north of their course, at 0708 Zulu, or 12:38 local, and the Imphal VOR beacon itself just 8 minutes later. Finally, he transmitted the aircraft's registration, the number of passengers they were expecting to disembark on arrival, and requested the latest weather.
Maintaining level 290 from Calcutta to your field. Departure from Calcutta was 0624, estimating a beam Kumbigram at time 0708, and overhead your field at 0716. Will you go ahead with your latest weather? Aircraft is Echo Foxtrot Lima and transit passenger figure is 3131.
In response, the tower controller at Imphal reported that the wind of the field was light westerly with a visibility of 7 kilometers and a low broken cloud layer at about 2,000 feet. A more significant overcast layer was observed at 10,000, with the temperature and dew point being recorded as 24 and 22 degrees centigrade respectively. Finally, he stated that the local QNH or sea level pressure was indicating 1009 hectopascals, the equivalent of 29.80 inches of mercury.
India 257, roger. At this time our current weather is wind 270 degrees 3 knots, visibility 7 kilometers, cloud scattered at 800, broken at 1800 and overcast at 10,000, temperature 24, dew point 22, QNH 1009.
Haldar turned to his co-pilot.
Imphal reporting low clouds.
Yes, scattered and broken.
With no specific distance information being transmitted from the Imphal VOR. Based on their estimated time remaining en route, Haldar instructed him to request descent.
Imphal Silchar is not reporting any traffic. Request descent from flight level 290.
257, roger. Descend to flight level 135 and report reaching.
With Haldar having commenced descent towards Imphal, Chowdhury tuned the aircraft's second VHF radio to the Indian Airlines company frequency at the airport and relayed information regarding their expected arrival time and the fact that they would require external ground power on arrival due to the aircraft's auxiliary power unit being unserviceable.
Imphal 257. ETA Imphal is 0725.
ETA Imphal 0725, roger.
That is affirmative. Please inform engineering on arrival that we require ground electrics. I say again, on arrival, require ground electrics.
As the descent continued, Haldar took time out to conduct an approach brief, which he was required to do in accordance with the company's standard operating procedures. The purpose of such a brief is to ensure that both crew members are familiar with all salient and relevant information regarding the approach they are about to conduct. Those topics reviewed include, but are not limited, to the navigation beacons to be used, both the lateral and vertical profiles to be flown, the expected aircraft landing configuration and performance, the approach minima, and the course of action to follow in the event that continuation of the approach becomes impossible, otherwise referred to as the missed approach procedure. Unbeknownst to Haldar at the time, his every word and expressed intention would subsequently be scrutinised in minute detail by the Indian investigation team.
Visual or otherwise, we'll go overhead at 10,000, then in the hold cleared to 8,000 on 070. This will be a teardrop entry inbound to 17. After that, leaving the VOR radial to 17, 8,000 to 5,000 check time 2.5 minutes, then in descending turn to 4,200, and then further descent on intercepting the glide slope. 5,000 feet, then a procedural turn. After that, further interception with glide slope descending to a decision, height of 224. Then, in case of a missed approach, climb straight ahead to 4,200, then turn left to join the VOR holding pattern at 8,000.
To explain, what Haldar had clearly stated was that regardless of the expected meteorological conditions, he would approach the Imphal VOR navigation beacon from the west at an altitude of 10,000 feet. Having passed directly overhead, his intention was to alter course onto a heading of 070 degrees magnetic to facilitate entry into the published holding pattern whilst commencing descent to 8,000 feet. This holding pattern would allow him to reverse direction and approach the beacon on an inbound course of 217 degrees magnetic, which would be maintained even after station passage. As mentioned earlier, with the VOR at Imphal having no associated DME or distance measuring equipment, the remainder of the procedure, which would ultimately align the aircraft with the ILS or instrument landing system for runway 04, could only be completed on the basis of time elapsed from passage overhead the beacon. In this regard, Haldar had correctly stated that the clocks were to be started on passing overhead the VOR, and further, that the procedural turn to the left would be commenced 2.5 minutes thereafter. But what he had failed to make reference to was the maximum permissible speed allowed for the procedure, that being 170 knots. At the risk of stating the obvious, the distance travelled in 2.5 minutes at 170 knots is notably different from that travelled in 2.5 minutes if one were travelling at, say, 190 knots, about 1.5 kilometres or nearly a mile to be exact. I use 190 knots here simply by way of example, but in truth any excess in airspeed above the limit of 170 knots would have introduced a positional error which had the potential to be catastrophic, given that terrain clearance, in the absence of any distance information being available, had been predicated on a specific leg length and radius of turn associated with this maximum defined airspeed. Why this limitation was important is that should it be exceeded, that any such exceedance would undoubtedly result in the aircraft straying into unprotected airspace, the consequences of which being all too obvious. Assuming the procedural turn to have been completed correctly, Haldar would then descend further with interception of the ILS glide slope to a decision height of 224 feet above the runway, the equivalent of 2,757 feet above sea level, at which point, if the runway environment was not in view, he would execute the missed approach procedure, commencing a climbing left turn back to the VOR to again enter the original holding pattern at 8,000 feet. Having cut the corner, naturally enough 257's estimated arrival time over the Imphal VOR was now in error, and so 11 minutes and 35 seconds before the accident, Chowdhury called the tower at Imphal with their revised estimate.
Imphal, India 257. Our revised time overhead Imphal is now 120712.
Much is made in the final report about the fact that Haldar had decided to descend somewhat prematurely, as compared to the original top of descent point stipulated on the flight plan. In truth though, having taken the shortcut as he did and without having any distance information to fix his actual position relative to the Imphal VOR, he most probably simply wanted to get down as early as possible so as to ensure that he would indeed cross the VOR level at 10,000 feet. To be honest, his reasoning for the early descent is completely academic and genuinely unimportant. What is important, however, is the fact that in taking the shortcut which he did, Haldar had demonstrated a willingness to bend the rules in the name of expediency, and having done it once and gotten away with it, he no doubt felt empowered to do it again. But whereas the first indiscretion had been inconsequential, his next would prove anything but. In clearing 257 to descend further to 10,000 feet, the tower controller at Imphal also requested that the crew report overhead the VOR and subsequently cleared them for the ILS approach to runway 04, which in effect meant that Haldar was now approved to conduct the approach exactly as he had briefed only 5 minutes previously.
257 now descend to 10,000 QNH 1009 hectopascals. Report over the VOR for the ILS runway 04.
From an observer's perspective, it's important to note that at this stage, both the crew of Indian 257 and the controller at Imphal all shared the same mental model of what was about to happen over the coming few minutes. The 737 would approach the Imphal VOR from the west, cross overhead at 10,000, and then subsequently descend while following the prescribed procedure to join the ILS for runway 04. But in the few precious minutes remaining before the 737 actually reached the VOR, this shared mental model, through no small measure of miscommunication and genuine ambiguity, was to completely fall apart. The investigation team would ultimately believe that the source of this ambiguity stemmed from an interpilot conversation recorded on the CVR or cockpit voice recorder just over 7.5 minutes before the accident. At the time, Haldar was heard to point out to Chowdhury various geographic landmarks, which you could obviously see through gaps in the cloud layer below. Landmarks which he believed fixed their position at about 25 nautical miles, or 46 kilometres to the west of the airport. That said, however, just 60 seconds later, when the controller at Imphal queried the crew as to their progress and current position, Chowdhury replied that they were now about 12 miles from the VOR and maintaining 10,000 feet.
257 Imphal, report your position.
We are now 12 miles inbound at 10,000 on 1009.
Okay, maintain and report overhead the VOR.
With no DME equipment being associated with the VOR at Imphal, Chowdhury's estimate of their position being 12 miles from the VOR could only have been rudimentary guesswork at best, based on Haldar's previous comments and the subsequent time which he perceived to have elapsed in the interim. However, it does mark an important milestone at which Haldar, despite what he had earlier briefed, seems to have had a significant change of heart. And with this change of heart, the respective perceptions of both the crew and controller rapidly began to diverge. A mere 6.5 minutes before impact, the crew of Indian 257 made a fateful request of the controller on duty.
Roger, overhead, can we set course directly outbound for letdown?
To which the controller simply replied, Roger, an affirmation of the crew's request, without in retrospect having a definitive understanding of what it was that was actually being asked of him. Based on the controller's response, Haldar now clearly believed that he had been given permission to make an early right-hand turn at his discretion in order to intercept an established outbound on the 217-degree radial. But in hindsight, the interaction which immediately followed between the controller and the crew suggests that the former's understanding and expectations were fundamentally different.
Indian 257, report your position.
We are approaching overhead.
Understand you are proceeding on radial 217 for the ILS.
That is affirmative.
Roger, give me a call commencing the procedure turn.
In his subsequent post-accident interview, the tower controller testified that it was never his intention for Indian 257 to turn early to establish on the outbound radial, and categorically stated that his expectation was that the 737 would pass overhead the VOR, establish briefly in the hold in order to reverse its direction of travel, and then subsequently establish on the 217-degree radial outbound, just as Haldar had briefed. When questioned about why he had responded in the affirmative to Haldar's request to set course directly outbound for letdown, he again reiterated that his actual intention was to communicate to the crew that having reversed direction in the hold, they could anticipate no delay and thus should expect to proceed directly outbound on the 217-degree radial at that time. Although slow to initially accept the controller's interpretation, senior management personnel from both the airline's flight operations and training departments were ultimately forced to agree that the controller's expectations were indeed reasonable, and that due process should have seen the aircraft pass overhead the VOR, reverse direction in the hold, and subsequently established on the 217-degree radial outbound. In commencing the turn outbound immediately and passing overhead the VOR, Haldar was now taking yet another shortcut, but this time, unlike his previous indiscretion, the outcome would be far more consequential. With the 737 now in the turn to establish on the 217-degree radial, Haldar turned to Chowdhury,
We might as well descend.
after which Chowdhury, apparently unconcerned by the change of plan, casually transmitted to air traffic control that they were indeed leaving 10,000.
257 on the outbound leg for letdown and descending to 5,000.
Perhaps, in retrospect, had the tower controller been more attentive, he might have suspected that something simply wasn't quite right. After all, just 2 minutes and 24 seconds earlier, the crew had reported that they still had 12 miles to run to the VOR. Now, apparently, per his expectation of what was to happen, not only had they passed overhead, but they had entered the hold, reversed direction, and were now heading outbound on the 217-degree radial while descending to 5,000 feet. And that simply wasn't possible given the time frame involved. Thus, a critical opportunity to query the crew as to what they were actually doing had been missed. Rather, the controller had simply reiterated his previous request for the crew to report when commencing the procedural turn, and left them to their own devices. As Haldar continued his turn outbound, the tower controller instead turned his attention to Indian Airlines Flight 890, an Airbus A320, which he cleared to enter runway 04 in anticipation of its departure to Guwahati. On the 737's flight deck over the next minute and a half or so, Haldar and Chowdhury discussed the heading to be flown in order to commence this same procedural turn, before subsequently reporting that they had passed overhead the outer marker, a report which was simply untrue. In preparation for the right-hand turn outbound, Haldar had selected the first stage of trailing edge flap, allowing him to slow the aircraft to a minimum of 190 knots. But 190 knots wasn't nearly slow enough, given that the maximum allowable speed for the procedure was stipulated to be 170, a difference of 37 kilometers per hour or 23 miles per hour, a not hugely significant amount, but enough to make a difference nonetheless. The result was that in making the turn to the right, the excessive speed had increased substantially the jet's radius of turn, making interception of the 217-degree radial outbound simply impossible. In fact, despite their intentions, the 737 had never been able to establish on the radial, meaning that passage overhead the outer marker was never going to happen. Had they actually done so, passage over the beacon would have generated both a visual and oral signal on the flight deck, which would have been recorded in the CVR, but in replaying the tapes, it was nowhere to be heard. More significant, however, having never established on the 217-degree radial, the crew had now no definitive way to fix their position, and not having left the holding fix to pass directly over the VOR in the first instance, had no time reference by which to gauge their progress. Under the circumstances, they should have identified that their efforts to expedite the approach were now beginning to undermine the safety of the operation. With high terrain in the area, the descent should have been immediately stopped, and the aircraft climbed back to a minimum safe altitude of at least 8,000 feet. But that isn't what happened. Haldar instead, with Chowdhury's placid acceptance, pushed on, continued the aircraft's descent, and critically began to improvise a fix to their current dilemma, thereby allowing a potentially dangerous situation to rapidly develop into something a whole lot worse. Unsuccessful in their attempts to establish on the 217-degree radial, at 12:44 and 38 seconds local, a mere 1 minute and 45 seconds before impact, the CVR recorded Chowdhury's declaration that 2 minutes were up. Despite the published procedure clearly stipulating that the geographic point at which the procedural turn should have been commenced was 2.5 minutes at 170 knots beyond the VOR. In turning early, it appears that Chowdhury had arbitrarily just picked a figure of 2 minutes to again improvise a fix. Victims of their own continuation bias, they were now simply making things up as they went along, and all the time blindly descending, in cloud, towards rising terrain. During this time period, 2 separate requests from air traffic control for the crew to verify their passing altitude resulted in incorrect information being relayed on both occasions. Post-accident examination of the jet's altimeters subsequently ruled out the possibility of any pre-impact malfunction, nor the possibility of the crew's misselection of the instrument's pressure datum. In other words, there was no deficiency found with the instrument, so whether the crew deliberately misreported the aircraft's altitude in order to disguise their improvised actions would become the subject of debate and further conjecture. Regardless, still trying to mentally follow the jet's progress, 10 seconds later the tower controller once more requested that the crew report their commencement of the procedural turn. Chowdhury quickly responded that the turn was already underway and that they would next report established inbound on the localizer, which defined the runway's extended centerline. Over the next 34 seconds, with the aircraft finally level at 5,000 feet and continuing to make the turn right towards the localizer, Haldar and Chowdhury hurriedly reconfigured their cockpit instrumentation to display the ILS for runway 04. Now that the turn to final had been commenced, Haldar was of the opinion that he was clear to descend still further to 4,200 feet, in accordance with the published procedure.
Altitude now 4200.
Had the aircraft been in the correct geographic position, such a descent would have been justified. However, given the crew's improvisations, the 737 wasn't anywhere near where it should have been, as the tower controller passed an updated weather observation, indicating that rain was now approaching the airfield from the east. He additionally made one more attempt to clarify the aircraft's progress in passing altitude. On the 737's flight deck, at the very same time the CVR recorded his communications being suddenly interrupted by the synthesized voice of the aircraft's ground proximity warning system, followed 6 seconds later by the sound of a violent impact as the recording suddenly stopped. With Indian 890 now airborne, and having received no answer to his previous query, the controller once again attempted to call 257. But despite multiple attempts to communicate with the 737, all went unanswered. It wouldn't be for another 3¼ hours before air traffic control at Imphal would finally receive definitive confirmation through a local police source that the wreckage of Flight 257 had been located on top of Thangjing Hills, on the 220-degree radial from the Imphal VOR, at a distance of 20.5 nautical miles. The aircraft being completely destroyed on impact resulted in the loss of all 68 souls on board. As part of the subsequent post-accident investigation, the actual letdown procedure for runway 04 was examined in detail. All such procedures are constructed with certain safety margins in mind, defined finite buffers which ensure additional adequate separation from terrain should an aircraft for whatever reason deviate from the published procedure. Such unintentional deviations are often the result of environmental factors or, in many cases, simply the result of poor execution on the part of the crews flying them. What was established was the fact that the distance from the Imphal VOR to the farthest point in the procedural turn, if the procedure was being flown correctly, equated to approximately 11 nautical miles. At this point of the procedure, an aircraft would have been descending from 5,000 to 4,200 feet above mean sea level. Further to the southwest, the first significant terrain which could possibly impact on the aircraft's flight path at this low altitude was a peak at a distance of 17.3 nautical miles and an elevation of 4,265 feet, meaning that in zero wind conditions, strict compliance with the published procedure would provide for a buffer of about 6 nautical miles from this conflicting terrain. But what if the wind at altitude hadn't been calm and an unfavourable tailwind had effectively pushed the aircraft further towards the hills, assuming that it had been complying with the 170 knots and 2.5-minute outbound stipulation? Modelling of just such a scenario had categorically proven that even with a 60-knot tailwind, an aircraft would likely have been displaced no more than about 2.5 nautical miles beyond the furthest point of the turn, compromising the established 6 nautical mile buffer to a lesser value of closer to 3.5, but still more than adequate to guarantee the continued safety of the flight and ensure sufficient terrain clearance. With this in mind, when records were checked, meteorological reports showed that the winds aloft at the time of the accident were actually no more than about 5 knots in the general area, and as such could not have had any adverse effect on the aircraft's flight trajectory. So, if environmental factors hadn't played their part in the demise of Indian 257, what of the crew's involvement? At 20.5 nautical miles from the VOR, the impact site lay nearly 3 nautical miles beyond the closest peak to the southwest. How the 737 had ended up this far from the airfield was thus the direct result of the crew's premature turn and their improvised guesswork as to how long they should proceed outbound. Having verified the crash site's elevation at about 5,200 feet above sea level, it was proven that the aircraft had in fact impacted the Thangjing Hills at a point some 200 feet below the local summit, and this, if the crew had been adhering to the procedure correctly, should never have been the case. As mentioned earlier, the remains of both altimeters once recovered from the crash site independently indicated values of close to 5,200 feet. Proof positive as far as the investigation team were concerned that no pre-impact technical faults had existed with either instrument, and that incorrect barometric setting on the part of the crew had not been a consideration. But it was ultimately, in the absence of any radar data, examination of the flight data and cockpit voice recorders which told the complete story of what had happened to Indian 257 and why it had strayed so far from the published procedure, although both had initially proved elusive. In the immediate aftermath of the accident, it was reported that many locals had descended on the crash site and removed pieces of wreckage, souvenirs for want of a better description, without any appreciation for what they were doing. A photographer on site had taken a picture of one individual descending from the hill's summit, with the CVR being carried on his back. This had allowed the recorder to be retrieved subsequently and its data downloaded. With regard to the flight data recorder, on foot of a tip-off from a local taxi driver, it was also later recovered, undamaged, from a village some 30 kilometres away from the crash site, having been hidden in a banana bush. With the data from both downloaded, the completely unnecessary, chilling and needless demise of Indian Airlines Flight 257 was made abundantly clear to all. Haldar's early turn to establish on the outbound radial meant fundamentally that the 737 would never be able to comply with the procedures published. With the excessive speed he was carrying, not only was his ability to establish on the radial completely compromised, but in the absence of any distance information being transmitted from the ground station, it was absolutely imperative that the aircraft pass overhead while heading in a southwesterly direction in order to fix a datum from which they could time the approach. In achieving neither, it is no exaggeration of the facts to say that the aircraft was essentially lost once the turn had been commenced, and descending blind in mountainous terrain while unsure of one's position was simply suicidal. Although Haldar's turn was undeniably reckless, the simple fact of the matter was that he had not sat alone on the 737's flight deck. So what of Chowdhury's involvement in the sorry saga? What of his voice? Despite having apparently been of equal rank, although admittedly not pilot in command on the day in question, one would have assumed that Chowdhury's prior experience would have alerted him to the dangers associated with what Haldar was attempting to do, and that being duly concerned, he would have made his reservations known. Alas, this isn't what happened. On the contrary, the transcript of the CVR recording merely recounted a persona best described as one of placid acceptance. No concern, no worry, no anxiety. Haldar had made the unilateral decision to do what he did, and Chowdhury had simply let him. The ground proximity warning system of the early 1990s wasn't sophisticated enough to be able to see ahead of the aircraft's trajectory. Thus, given that the incline of the crash site was in the order of some 60 to 70 degrees, the warning had been triggered a mere 6 seconds prior to impact, an incredibly tight time window within which the crew had to acknowledge and react accordingly. With the aircraft still descending at the time the warning was triggered, despite this incredibly short notice, the flight data recorder did nonetheless record the aircraft level off, indicative of the fact that Haldar had attempted to correct the aircraft's trajectory, despite the fact that follow-up simulator reconstructions would categorically prove that even with the textbook response, the subsequent collision with the hill was unavoidable. But as the investigation deepened, more uncomfortable truths about Indian Airlines began to surface. In just one such instance, the investigation team moved to examine whether Haldar's actions on the day had been a once-off, or whether this demonstrated behaviour of cutting corners was more characteristic of his general operation. As such, the airline was asked to surrender previous flight data recordings relating to this specific route and from flights under the command of this specific captain. In compliance, 4 such records were indeed surrendered, and what they revealed was concerning to say the very least. In all 4 cases, the data revealed that Haldar had routinely taken the same en route shortcut to avoid having to overfly Agartala, and more worryingly had, on each of the flights under review, likewise turned immediately outbound on passing overhead the Imphal VOR, just as he had done on the accident flight. No doubt, having behaved this way in the past without suffering any ill effect, Haldar had become empowered to repeat the same actions again and again, in effect normalising this behavioural pattern. In fairness though, these flight data recordings were by definition unable to shed any light on the environmental conditions of the time. Thus, Haldar, if visual conditions prevailed, may have been well within his rights to behave as he did. However, that said, given that Imphal is affected by the annual monsoon, meaning on average 94 days and 54 inches of rain, to think that all 4 flights would have been conducted in totally visual conditions is somewhat unlikely. Even had they been, the consensus amongst the Indian Airline representatives was nonetheless that the crew should have adhered strictly to the published procedure and completed it in its entirety by coming directly overhead the VOR and entering the hold in the first instance. To do otherwise, even if visual with the terrain below, was largely counterproductive and achieved very little. In their defence, these same management representatives claimed that without receiving any reports of wrongdoing or non-compliance, they'd been completely unaware of Haldar's behaviour and thus were effectively powerless to effect any change. Be that as it may, what's striking here is the fact that, at the very least, 4 company pilots had witnessed at first hand Haldar's procedural indiscretions. Yet none of the 4 had seen it appropriate or necessary to bring the matter to the company's attention. Whether this speaks to the reporting culture within Indian Airlines at the time, an autocratic or intimidating command gradient, or indeed reflects on the quality of pilot training whereby such indiscretions are not deemed hazardous enough to warrant a report, is largely academic. The important takeaway was the fact that unprofessional and potentially dangerous behaviour was being practiced on the line, and nobody in authority apparently knew anything about it. In reality, however, Haldar had flown the route between Calcutta and Imphal many more times than the 4 mentioned here. In fact, within the 6 months immediately preceding the accident flight, he had operated the route on no less than 36 occasions. That being the case, the investigation team were of the opinion that this frequent exposure to the airport at Imphal and the surrounding geography had led Haldar to become complacent and overly confident. Specifically, in view of what had been heard on the CVR a mere 7.5 minutes or so before impact, they were suspicious that Haldar had used what he thought were familiar landmarks in order to fix the aircraft's position, an assessment which was most probably incorrect. Although the full procedure for the ILS to runway 04 had been predicated on elapsed time from overhead the VOR, and as such negated the need for distance measuring equipment to be co-located with the navigation beacon. Had it been, undoubtedly both Haldar and Chowdhury would have been readily able to see that the flight was deviating way too far to the southwest and into uncharted territory. Ironically, this distance measuring equipment was in fact on site, having been delivered in July the month previous, but simply hadn't been installed by the time of the accident. Had it, who knows if the outcome for Indian Airlines Flight 257 would have been any different, but there is a possibility that it might. Playing the what-if game still further, during the post-accident investigation it had come to light that the tower controller on duty at the time had never actually been formally rated by the Indian National Airports Authority, though he had been informally authorised to handle arriving and departing traffic at Imphal by the senior on-site manager. Had this individual been monitoring the tower controller's actions, perhaps the ambiguity between the two with regard to the aircraft's intended route of flight could have been identified and resolved. But he hadn't been, and although available at the airport, he had not been physically in the tower facility at the time of 257's approach and ultimate impact with the terrain to the southwest. So yet again the question has to be asked as to whether this supervisor's direct intervention would have influenced the eventual outcome. Who can really say for sure? But, as with many aviation accidents, history will recall that error chains leading up to these fateful events are often long, complex and protracted, whereby an often subtle change of events can have profound implications. With the publication of the final accident report on April 30th, 1992, some 8.5 months later, the investigation team cited that the accident occurred most probably by reason of a grave error having been committed on the part of the pilot in command, that being Captain Shaker Haldar, in not adhering to the operational flight plan or ILS letdown chart. In making his early right-hand turn to intercept the outbound leg of the procedure, he had lost his time reference, ultimately resulting in the aircraft being misplaced in the hilly terrain to the southwest of the airfield. Such action, they speculated, may well have been influenced by his familiarity with the local terrain. In conclusion, they would ultimately make a total of 50 recommendations, the most important of which related to Indian Airlines, the National Airports Authority, and the Office of the Director General of Civil Aviation in India. With regard to the airline, it was suggested that they reiterate to all their pilots the importance of meticulously following all stipulated operational procedures, and that such practices be proactively monitored by a dedicated flight standardization department. With regard to their in-house training syllabi, again it was recommended that the operator impress upon its junior pilots in particular that they not only have the right but indeed an obligation to speak up if they become uncomfortable or fundamentally disagree with a more senior colleague's actions or decisions, and should be reassured that on foot of such intervention they will suffer no ill consequence or recrimination whatsoever. In this context, it was thus suggested that the principles of effective crew resource management should be introduced into the airline's training programs without delay, so as to further promote a safer operational culture. The Director General of Civil Aviation and the National Airports Authority, for their parts, were encouraged to tighten up the processes of training and periodically checking the controllers in their charge, and should, as a matter of priority, ensure that only suitably trained and formally rated personnel are allowed to oversee and handle such operations. Like so many other needless aviation accidents, the story of Indian Airlines Flight 257 is the story of willful procedural non-compliance. One man's interpretation of how things should be done, with little apparent regard for the potential consequences, and the silent, passive facilitation of another who stood by and allowed it to happen.